We are, Mark, and we've got Stanton Friedman on the line in our classroom. Stanton Friedman received a BS and MS degrees in physics from the University of Chicago. Stanton and Carl Sagan, you remember Carl Sagan, the NASA engineer? He and Stanton Friedman were classmates. And at one point in my educational pursuits, I was one of Carl Sagan's students. Stanton worked for 14 years as a nuclear physicist for such companies as General Electric, General Motors, Westinghouse, TRW, Aerojet General Nucleonics, McDonnell Douglas. Stanton's been a guest on KWTO George Norrie's Coast to Coast Radio. And Stanton, welcome.
I'm glad to be on. I should correct, Carl was not an engineer,
an
astronomer.
He was a consultant and advisor to NASA.
Yes, I'll buy that, yes. But as a matter of fact, we once had a conversation where I pointed out that engineers were believers in certain phenomena. He says, oh, they'll believe anything, which I thought was baloney.
Well, I'll tell you what. We've got a classroom full of students that spreads over 5 states, and we're interested in how nuclear power is generated. Can you help us and give our class a thumbnail sketch of how nuclear power has been generated? Because I know that you have been involved in the construction, engineering, and design of nuclear power stations.
Yeah, and power plants outside of stations, too, like for space applications and things like that. The basic principle is straightforward. It turns out, as we got smarter and smarter about what's going on in the world around us, that we began to realize that Einstein was right. Energy equals mc squared. C is the speed of light, a very large number. So if you could figure out a way to convert some of the mass to energy, boy, would you have a lot of energy per pound of stuff involved. It's not like coal or oil or stuff like that.
Yeah.
A little bit goes a long way.
Right.
And so
right.
now, Einstein and Lord Rutherford, two of the great scientists of the last century, neither one thought you'd ever be able to get anything useful out of that. They believed that the concept was correct, but how are you going to do that? Well, it turns out there were some discoveries made. One of them was, believe it or not, the neutron, like 1932. It hasn't been so long that we realized that, hey, you know what? There are neutrons inside atoms, the nucleus of the atom. And it turns out that neutrons can interact with other atoms. The amount of interaction depends on which atom, which nucleus you're talking about, and the energy of the neutron. And there's a whole bunch of different variables here. But the important point is that toward the end of the 1930s, as they were scientists in Europe were systematically bombarding different elements with neutrons to see what happened. What comes out of this? And it turns out that gee whiz, some atoms capture a neutron and become radioactive. They give off, and that term, radiation and radioactive, the terms have been used much too loosely. It's like saying people. Well, do you mean a man or a woman, somebody who's dead or alive, tall, short? You know, it covers a lot of ground. Radiation covers a lot of ground, too. Some people think of neutrons as part of the whole radiation thing. Others, the focus is on gamma rays. Now, that sounds exotic, but everybody's familiar with X-rays. Nobody worries when you go into a doctor for a chest X-ray. Very penetrating radiation, real small stuff that can move very quickly and can go right on through you. And believe it or not, there were scientists who, when Röntgen said he had exposed some materials to a photographic film, and just inadvertently, they were in a drawer together and found something on the film when he processed it, and gradually got smarter and smarter, and pretty soon you could put a hand on the film, and he had some radioactive materials, and those radioactive, the particles that came from that would go right through the hand and form a pattern on the film. And so you could see a broken bone, for example. And Lord Kelvin, one of the great British scientists of a little over 100 years ago, called it undoubtedly a hoax. There couldn't be any such thing, you see. Every generation thinks it knows all there is to know, and anybody who says they're wrong and have missed something doesn't know what they're talking about. They're just not smart enough.
Yeah, I think even in around late 1800s, we were going to close the patent office because everything's been invented.
Yeah, and there are a lot of instances of this. A lot of smart people have said very stupid things. I have a book out with Kathleen Marden called "Science Was Wrong." We probably should put out a second edition because there's so many examples to choose from. But certainly, the guy who said space travel is utter bilge, he was only the Royal Astronomer of England, and the great astronomer of the United States in the 19th century said that Simon Newcomb was his name, and he was such an important guy that when he died in 1909, the President of the United States attended his funeral. But he had said in 1903, October, that if there was one thing he was certain of, and he said it in a much more flowery way, men would never fly in a vehicle.
Yeah.
That was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight.
Yeah.
So anyway, when they found the neutron and they started exposing all kinds of elements to the neutron, something weird turned up. Now, the highest atomic number element, that's the total number of protons in the nucleus. Hydrogen has 1. Uranium has 92.
Mm-hmm.
And they were just systematically exposing each of the elements to neutrons and see what happened. When they exposed uranium, it was discovered, son of a gun, what is this stuff? Now, when you capture a neutron, the nucleus should be very similar. Just have one more neutron than before. But here was some stuff that didn't make any sense. What they discovered was fission.
Yeah.
So instead of one nucleus that was radioactive, they found 2 nuclei, but if you added up the mass of the 2 nuclei, it came out a little less than that of the original uranium. Some of that mass was converted to an awful lot of energy. That was very exciting.
Stanton, we're going to have to take a really quick break, and we're going to come right back because I'm interested in hearing about this extra energy that was discovered, this massive amount from a small amount of mass.
Gentlemen, let's take a brief pause. You are listening to USA Prepares on the powerhouse of the Midwest, KWTO.
No whining. Only expert guests and seasoned opinions. Instruction that matters. At the controls, Vincent Finelli and Mark Wright.
Welcome back to USA Prepares, where converging threats are confronted daily on KWTO 560 AM, the powerhouse of the Midwest. I'm Mark Wright. I'm here with the original survival economist, Vincent Finelli. And Vinny, today we are confronting the converging threat of nuclear radiation with Stanton Friedman.
We are. And Stanton, you were talking about the early days of nuclear power generation and its discovery. Can you continue?
Yeah, the kicker here was it was clear that uranium was peculiar, if you will. It produced new nuclei and energy, a lot of energy. The kicker was, though, and what they had to find out, and this was a great discovery, was, okay, how many neutrons do you also get when you split the atom? If you get enough, then this could be a chain reaction. Each of those neutrons causes another atom to split, and it produces neutrons which cause other atoms to split, and it goes on and on and on real quick like. And it turns out that the discovery was that over 2 neutrons per fission. That was under 1, you're not going to get anywhere with this kind of thing, but it was over 2, and that was the discovery that made the decision to proceed with an atomic bomb project.
Mm-hmm.
That's what made it. Okay, the problem was with uranium, I said uranium like it was one substance. Well, everything seems to have more than one isotope, a different number of neutrons in the nuclei.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it turns out with uranium, it's uranium-235. That's got 92 protons, and the rest of those particles are neutrons. Now, there's also uranium-238, and unfortunately, just about all uranium, 99.3%, is uranium-238. So, how do we get enough to make a bomb, or to make an active reactor, or to do other things? We got to separate the isotopes. And during World War II, there was a plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was a gaseous diffusion plant. Fancy way of saying you take a gas with uranium in it, uranium hexafluoride, not something you'd want to drink for dinner, believe me. And you'd pass it through a big plate that had little tiny holes. You'd pump this gas through there, and the lighter isotope would go through a little faster. So by the time you got to the end of this mile-long plant, would you believe, using 5% of the atomic power, of the electric power being produced in the United States. In secret, mind you. And it was there in Tennessee because that's where TVA was, and so they had the electricity.
Is that why the TVA was built, so that they could have the power to generate
No, the other way around. The TVA was there. They weren't using a lot of the electricity. They looked around the country to find where can we put something that's going to use an enormous amount of electricity with anybody knowing about it, in other words. Mm-hmm. And they found Tennessee, and it was all done in secret. Right. Like I say, 5% of the power of the United States, that's a lot of energy when you think about it.
Sure.
In some small little town is... At one time, 60,000 people, different numbers show up, were involved in the Manhattan Engineering District to develop atomic bombs. The hard part, they had some brilliant scientists who could figure out the theory, even though they didn't have fancy computers back then. They used a lot of slide rules, I might add. I hope people know what a slide rule is. Anyway.
I sure do.
They produced the U2. They gradually enriched the amount of uranium-235. Now, there are reactors. Today's reactors use uranium that's enriched to perhaps 2 or 3%. For nuclear weapons, you'd like to get 92%. Now, here in Canada, we use heavy water-moderated reactors that slows the neutrons down, and we can use natural uranium. You can't with regular water, because it turns out hydrogen absorbs a few neutrons. Oxygen is pretty good, but if you use heavy hydrogen, another isotope, it doesn't absorb neutrons worth a darn. So you can get by with natural uranium. That saves you a lot of money, trouble, and so forth and so on. So anyway, the whole point of this thing was to produce enough uranium-235, and along the way, they found, there's another isotope that doesn't exist in nature, plutonium. Uranium captures a neutron, it becomes neptunium, that captures a neutron, and it becomes plutonium, and plutonium is even more fissionable than uranium-235. But it only took a huge plant at Hanford, Washington, to take some of that uranium-238 and with a long, expensive, difficult process make it into plutonium-239. And most bombs use plutonium because it's a bit more efficient, fewer pounds.
Mm-hmm.
And this matters, you got to make the stuff to begin with. Anyway, the whole point of this thing was to get a release of energy quickly, extremely quickly. That's your problem, you see. Once you start the fissioning, you're releasing energy, that energy from converting mass to energy. But that tends to drive all the particles apart, and if they don't stay together, how can you have a chain reaction? The particles are long gone. There goes the neutron with nothing to capture. So it's a tricky sort of business. But let me illustrate why you do this. In World War II, in 1942 or so, we developed blockbuster bombs. 10-ton blockbuster, 10 tons of TNT equivalent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
The energy was released from that. Make a big hole in the ground, I'll tell you that. Well, the first atomic bomb released as much energy That's about 15,000 tons of TNT. So you go from 10 tons to
Right.
15,000.
And that's what they used to refer to on the news as a 15 kiloton bomb, and they would test those things
Yeah.
in the Midwest.